Let's find out how each state voted relative to the national popular vote for the 2004 presidential election. We'll find out which states voted to the left or the right of the country. So let's first glance over these results to get our national baseline. This was a close election. George W. Bush won it with 286 electoral votes. He carried 31 states and he got 50.7% of the popular vote. John Kerry took the loss. He finished with 251, 19 states and D.C., and he got 48.3%. So the popular vote margin here for Bush was 2.4. That's going to be our baseline. Anything higher than that in each state is going to be relatively redder. Anything less than that is going to be relatively bluer. We're also going to use 4 levels of shading. The darkest are going to be over 10%. Then it's 5 to 9.9. Then 1 to 4.9. Anything under 1% is going to be the lightest shade. So there's not going to be a spreadsheet this time. We're going to go through each state alphabetically, and we're going to go quick. First up, in Alabama, they voted for Bush by 25.7, but the entire country already voted in that same direction by a much less 2.4. So 25.7 minus 2.4 comes out to a relative percentage of 23.3. In Alaska, that was almost the exact same, 23.2 redder. Next, it was also redder by much less in Arizona at 8.1. Arkansas was a little under that at 7.3. California is the first blue state. It comes in at 12.3. Colorado, back then, it voted for Bush, and it was still relatively redder at 2.3. Connecticut was more friendly to John Kerry at 12.7. Delaware, right at 10%. Florida went relatively toward Bush by another 2.6. Georgia, way redder at 14.2. Hawaii, opposite direction, 11.1. Idaho, way redder at 35.7. Illinois was noticeably bluer at 12.7. Indiana, even more in the other direction at 18.2. Iowa did narrowly vote for Bush, but the state was still relatively bluer at 1.7. More red states, it's Kansas at 23, Kentucky 17.5, and Louisiana 12.1. Then we've got Maine at large. They came in bluer at 11.4. The first district was over 14. The second was over 8. Then in Maryland, that was also bluer at 15.4. Massachusetts was relatively the bluest state in the country. That makes sense. That was Kerry's home state, and it supported him more relatively by 27.5. Michigan, much more modestly bluer at 5.8. Minnesota, almost the same at 5.9. Then we've got more red states. It's Mississippi coming in at 17.2. Missouri, way closer back then at 4.8. Montana, 18.1. Nebraska at large, 30.8. The first district was more than 24. The second, 19. The third, 48. Then it's Nevada. That state had relatively the smallest percentage out of all 50. It voted for Bush by 2.6. That means it was just 0.2% redder. New Hampshire was bluer by 3.7. New Jersey, even more at 9.1. New Mexico, which Bush also won in 04, but it was relatively bluer at 1.7. New York, way bluer at 20.7. North Carolina, redder at an even 10. North Dakota, redder at an even 25. Ohio voted for Bush, but it was relatively bluer by a tiny 0.3. Oklahoma, super red at 28.8. Oregon, modestly bluer at 6.6. Pennsylvania is bluer at 4.9. Rhode Island, heavily blue at 23.1. Now more red states. South Carolina, 14.7. South Dakota, 19.1. Tennessee, 11.9. Texas, 20.5. Utah, that was the biggest margin out of all the states. It was relatively redder at a huge 43.1. Vermont, though, is bluer at a big 22.5. Virginia, back then the state was red, and it was relatively 5.8 redder. Washington was bluer at 9.6. West Virginia, redder at 10.5. Wisconsin, mildly bluer at 2.8. And Wyoming is redder at a massive 37.4. And if you throw in Washington, D.C., they were relatively extremely bluer at 82.3. So that's the entire map. And we've got 3 states on here that actually voted for Bush, but they were still relatively bluer. That's New Mexico, Iowa, and Ohio. So an extremely competitive election, especially in the Electoral College. Back then, Colorado and Virginia were voting red. Arizona and Georgia still reliably red, not considered swing states. The Rust Belt had yet to make its lurch toward the right. Nebraska's second and Maine's second have yet to flip in opposite directions, and the Pacific Northwest and some states in the Northeast, not as blue as they would later become. You've also got Florida, which was competitive back then, and you can almost say the same thing about Missouri. 2004 was kind of the first election that it was no longer considered that swing state bellwether, and Bush obviously dominated in Texas. Utah was extremely red back then, and Nevada went red, but it was competitive. But if you focus at the numbers at the top, using the 2004 electoral votes, states that voted more Democratic for John Kerry were at 284. For Bush, they were at 254. That's again going to be because in this map, those three states that went for Bush flipped and were relatively bluer. So you could go on and on about this, but in the end, this is how the map looks in 2004. If you want to know how each state voted relative to the national popular vote, so let me know in the comments. What are the biggest takeaways for you on this map? I'm sure there's at least a few states that surprised you in the direction that they voted. Let me know what you're taking a look at down below on your way out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.